I was just reminded as we were singing those songs together, that as Christians, everything for us hangs and falls on Jesus, doesn't it? We really need to understand that in fresh and real ways, that, all of our hope depends on Jesus being who he is and on his life, death and resurrection. That's, as Christians, where we stand. If you remove Jesus from our faith, we have nothing left. And that's why it's so important to be doing these studies together in Mark, as we're looking at the identity of Jesus. And that's where we're going again today, to the Gospel of Mark, and Stu's going to bring that next episode for us in this ongoing journey of discovering who Jesus is, as he's revealing himself to his disciples and those around him. So thanks, Stuart. We're looking forward to what you're going to share with us.
All right, we'll see how we go today. Hey, it is always good to come here. We always look forward to coming back to PAC over the years. So we're delighted to be here today. I've brought some friends along with us as well, and they're having a look at the place and seeing what you guys do, because then Cohen's going to come back next week and preach as well. So it's always exciting to be here. It's just lovely to worship this morning, to share some thoughts, to hear what you guys are thinking, see where you guys are at. And then to share that worship music just then was really, really great. The music group was fantastic. Thank you for that little part that you guys played. I know you guys practice, and it always comes across really well. So thank you for letting us come into your midst. It is good to be here now. Yeah, all the note takers, all right, bear with me today. I've got some points, but they're a bit scattered, right? And I'll explain what that is in a minute. But let's start by just praying and seeing what God's got for us as we start there. Lord, we're just so thankful that despite who we are and what we're like and where we've come from, what we've done, we sit here or stand here in your midst before your throne because of what Jesus has done for us. There's nothing here that we can bring that you don't already have, apart from more worship. And we got to do that today, and it's exactly what you wanted. And so we thank you for just letting us come into your throne room to do that. Lord, I pray now as we just look into your word that you would just journey with us again, that you would help us to learn more about who you are, as Tim said before, in your life, in your death and your resurrection, and now as our King. It's all we need. But we tend to creep away from that. We tend to walk away from it sometimes, and sometimes we even run. So we want to come back to you. We want to sit before you. We want to learn from you. We want to grow with you because we need it desperately. And so we just ask for that today and pray this in your name. Amen. So bear with me. I've got technology going everywhere. I've got a laptop. I've got the screen at the back, the screen behind me. But bear with me. We'll see how we go. Tim's given me Mark chapter 4, verse 35 to 41. So if you'd like to turn to that, that's where we're going to be for today. It's a bit of a short passage, but it's a pretty good one. And if you are just creeping through the book of Mark by the looks of it, if I got only 6 verses, good luck. You'll be there in a couple of years' time still. But that's okay, because Mark is good, right? It's a good place to be. So bear with me today. Anyway, all right. You guys know a little bit about storms here, being right on the coast. I'm sure you're quite aware of how bad it can get sometimes. I've got a little bit of a picture here, actually. Let's see if it comes up. This one here. Found this on the interweb. This is actually somewhere along the coastline along here. I'm not exactly sure. You guys might know the coastline better than me. But I'm not sure even when it was. But this is along the coastline of Sydney somewhere. It's not Northern Beaches, all right? We won't claim it as being the north. But it's down here somewhere. This must have been an amazing stormy day. I can't imagine how big those waves would have been. If you were a surfer, any surfers here? Yep, I can't imagine what it would be like being out the back of that. All I can remember, I got to surf once. It was bodyboarding, wasn't surfing, so it doesn't count. But it does? All right, I'll claim it then, right? We'll go with it. So many years back in the 90s, I got to, a guy took me down to Ulladulla. He was from down there. He took me out in the sets. They were 10-foot sets. And yeah, I couldn't even get out. All right, that's how big it was. It was just, I was just struggling to get past where it was breaking. And so it was an amazing day, but this must have been even bigger. Another little thought comes to mind. We've just spent 7 years down in Tasmania, and we're on the west coast, northwest coast of Tasmania there, and there's a place called the Edge of the World. Has anybody ever been there, to the Edge of the World? Yep. It's an amazing place. It's really worth going to if you ever get down that way, because it's always really windy. It blows a gale in there. It's like really bad. And if you've got a little bit of wind, rain with it, which it probably will as well, because you're down in that area of the world, amazing storms that come through. Now we're not going to look at we're going to look at a physical storm. Jesus is going to take us into a physical storm in a minute. But actually the text is more than that. Okay? Now I'm not sure of what the storms are like in your life. All right? Certainly, the storms that you might have been traveling through haven't probably gone too well. Maybe some of them have been mental. Maybe some of your storms in your life are a mental storm. You're all right with the physical things, but mentally, it's all up here happening for you. When there's a struggle on, it's in your mind. It could be an illness. You might have struggled through some illnesses recently that have been a bit like a storm. It could be linked to depression. It could be linked to other things like work. Maybe work's a bit of a stress. Tim's just described some situations with the houses and stuff like that. That's been a bit of a struggle for him recently. And of course, coming up on Tuesday, there's a lot of stress around that sort of thing that's going on. It could be relational. It could be very much relational. If you're a mother or a father with little children, the stresses that come around little children are quite amazing. As they grow up, it doesn't sort of start to go away. It changes over time, but it doesn't go away. So family is a big thing. Sometimes it's a spiritual stress, a spiritual storm that you might be traveling through. I think times aren't going well with the Lord, or you might have drifted away, or you're trying to come back, or there might be sin in your life which is causing those storms. Storms aren't good. Listen to this. Look at this little picture. I'm going to click on here, actually. I remember to do that. This little note here from Ben. And if you guys were in the pandemic, you had to do any homeschooling. Hands up if you had to do homeschooling pandemic. All right, might relate to this one. All right, Ben wrote this. This is a little note that he had to write during homed school. It is not going good. All right, my mum's getting stressed out. My mum is really getting confused. I can relate to that, the work that's coming through, right? We took a break so my mum can figure this stuff out. And I'm telling you, it's not going good. All right? If you had to do anything like that during homeschooling, I'm sure that would have been a confession that would have been shared. I know we had to do a little bit of it, but Sydney was a little bit worse than what we had. So I just share the sentiment there. Now, it's not going good. It's a good sentiment that Ben's shared there, that when you're facing a storm and you're like, that's what it feels like. Some of these storms they're a reaction to what we've done, our actions. Sometimes we've made bad decisions in life. We end up finding ourselves in a place where we don't want to be. That might be for you, I'm not sure. Other times, that situation you might be in might be because of others around you. You're doing the right thing, or you're charting the course, you're doing we're going where God wants you to, but there's others in your life which are causing some of these storms that you're experiencing. Sometimes the storms, I have no doubt, it's cause of the devil. Satan is having a go. And lastly, and I think what we're going to look at today, is sometimes the storms in your life are actually part of God's plan. And so this is really important to sort of get our heads around. And the question we're going to look at the end of it is then, what is your response to that storm? What is your response to the storm in your life? So let's have a look at this. Get the right button here. All right, this is what we want to look at. So what do we do when we feel there's nothing we can do in the storms of life? What do we do when we feel there's nothing we can do in the storms of life? Stand still? That's a good idea. I'll put that right at the end. We'll get that one in. All right. Write that one down. All right. Because this is something I think we experience more often than we like to admit. No doubt we come up to the door on Sunday morning, and if someone says, how are you going? You're probably going to respond with the word, good. It's not always the case, is it? Sometimes you're in the middle of the storm when you walk in the door, It's really hard to explain what's going on because you feel like there's nothing you can do. Hopefully through what we learned today in Mark from Jesus is that if we believe that Jesus can, so we can, when we cannot. Okay? We want to believe that Jesus can so that we can when we cannot. And I want to explain that a little bit more as we go along. This is really important to sort of think about as we go through life. Life is really just, probably for most of us, a series of storms. And sometimes you walk out of one storm and you walk straight into another. Maybe of different category, but certainly life can be like that. And sometimes you're facing a number of storms all at the same time. So we'll have more of a look. All right, I'll get the right picture here. Okay, this is today's storm here. There we go. All right, let's read the text. Mark chapter 4, verse 35. It says in verse 35, "That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, 'Let us go over to the other side.' Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so that it nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, 'Teacher, don't you care if we drown?' He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, 'Quiet, be still.' Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, 'Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?' They were terrified and asked each other, 'Who is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him.'" So this is a picture actually of Galilee. This is the very lake that these guys probably were going across. This is more current day, obviously, more buildings in the background there. You can imagine this is a lake, and it's situated in a place in Galilee. It's sitting about 200 metres below sea level, and it's quite well known that this lake would get very, very, very wavy. The winds would come down and blow it up and bring it up for a bad day. But looking at our text, what's really important for us to notice here is a very crucial thing. As Mark describes the events, he records it with some accuracy which is quite great for its time. Most texts in this time weren't written like this, but Mark does add some interesting details. First of all, it's in the evening. Earlier that day, it says in Mark chapter 4, verse 1, Jesus got into a boat and started teaching the crowd on the side of the lake. Evidently, it seems that he'd been there all day in the boat teaching the crowds. It's a long day for teaching. If you're a teacher, you know that. But Jesus had done it for a boat. He didn't have a microphone. He did it just standing there as they listened. They learnt a lot of things, but as evening came, Jesus commands his disciples, "Let's go. We're going over to the other side." Not the normal thing to be done, to be travelling at night to go across. Much better to go in the daytime. At that time, it was probably somewhat calm. The disciples and Jesus just go off. It says that leaving the crowd behind, verse 36, they took him just as he was. No time to get anything else. No time to get out and just check with a few things. But just as he was in the boat, they left. There are other boats with them, but he was in there with his disciples. It then describes in verse 37, a furious squall came up and the waves were breaking over the boat so that they were nearly swamped. Now this indicates that probably it was more than what they expected. It's not normal to go out into that sort of a storm. We look at Jesus. Where is Jesus placed in the boat? He's not just anywhere in the boat, he's in the stern. He's in the back of it. And he's sleeping. Sleeping on a cushion. I'm not sure what the cushion's condition would be like by now. Maybe a little bit damp. I don't know if you've ever been camping, you've had to sleep with a damp cushion before. It's not the nicest feeling. But this is Jesus. These are the details that Mark reveals to us. These details are, while they seem small, are actually really helpful for us to understand that as Mark records, and the other gospel writers included, we think of Luke's recording in Acts as well, the Bible is full of minute details which add up to show us how real it really was. We're not reading from a mythical book here. This is not just a storybook that somebody wrote in their time, like Tolkien or someone like that. These are real events with real people, with a real Jesus. This is really important for us to remember. Okay? If it was just a myth, the impact of this story may not be as great as it is. And we want to understand that. So let's have a look at our first point from the text. That's not our first point, by the way. But it's important to note. It really helps us to understand where Jesus is coming from to help us in our storms if it's real for him. All right. I've got to remember what I'm doing here. I'm not clicking and you're not seeing it. But let's have a look at verse 38. So it says, Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Many of these disciples are actually skilled fishermen. That's their day job. That's what they've been doing for years. They were trained as young boys to go out and fish. They knew what a good storm would be like, and they knew when they should be in it and when they should be out of it. Evidently, here in this space, they are realizing the fact very quickly they should not be there. There is water coming into the boat. They understand the lake. They understand the winds, the storms. They understand what's happening at that time. They are fearing for their lives. They're probably in a position on the lake where they know it's too far to shore to swim. I don't know if you've ever been in the middle of the lake out in a boat, and you know that out in the ocean, if you get out in the water, and you go, it's really far to land. If I can't get back in the boat, I'm in trouble. This is what these guys were experiencing. Their nervousness is a sign that this storm is very, very real. So that's the disciples. But what about Jesus? Well, it says about this, it says, he got up, he rebukes the wind and the waves, quiet, be still, and the wind died down. On the opposite side, Jesus is asleep. He's not in a houseboat. He's not protected from the elements, but he's asleep. Now, he could be very exhausted from the day, and no doubt he was. But also, I think there's an amazing factor happening here where Jesus is at peace in the middle of the storm. He is comfortable with the storm, in fact, as opposed to the disciples, who are skilled fishermen who are not. So Jesus, in his humanness, tired, yes, from the day's work, is also in his humanness, in faith, knowing that everything's okay. You see the contrast? As a human, he demonstrates actually what we should be like in the midst of a storm. Jesus trusts the Father that everything is okay. He's the model of faith. Now, how can Jesus also be like this? You see, Jesus says these things. He says he got up, he rebuked the wind and the waves, and he says, "Quiet, be still." How can he do that? Well, he can because he's more than just a human. He is God as well. Here he displays his divine power. He says, "Quiet," or literally peace. Quiet and stay. And everything stops. It's not just it continues on for a little bit. If you've ever been out on a boat or you've ever been near the shore and the wind dies down, the waves still go for a long. No, here everything just stops. It's an amazing power, but We know it's amazing power because it's amazingly God's power. And as the disciples see this, potentially, maybe, hopefully, they might reflect back to what they know from the Psalms. It says in Psalm 89:9, it says that you rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. Or maybe it's Psalm 107:25, where it says, for he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which he lifted up the waves of the sea. So he is in command, just like his Father would be, like he can do, because he is God. He doesn't go and call on a higher power. He calls on his power. Okay? And that's how he can do this. Jesus can because he is all-powerful. As I'm preparing this message, I usually go and investigate a little bit of art. I'm not sure whether that's because when I was young I liked a little bit of art, but I like to go and have a look at some art that depicts the scenes. And if you go through history, the influence of the church on art has been quite amazing, and some of the great artists have painted these scenes. One of those artists is Rembrandt. This is his picture depicting this scene. It's a little bit hard to see up there. I'm sorry about that. I'm going to zoom in so you can see a little bit better. So this is Rembrandt. This is Rembrandt's first known artwork in 1633. So a couple of hundred years ago before now. It was his largest one as well, apparently. But this is a very interesting sort of depiction of this scene. We've got the boat, we've got the disciples, we've got Jesus, we've got the storm happening. And as I was looking at this, I'm going, this is great. Always good to find an image of what you're preaching about, just to see what you can see. But as I looked at it, I'm like, there's something really interesting here. So I don't know why I did it, but I decided, let's count the disciples. All right? Let's count the disciples. And I'll get you to do it. Can anybody count how many? Obviously, Jesus, I was going to use this laser because apparently it does work. Here we go. There's Jesus there. Okay. There's actually a disciple there. It's a bit hard to see. He's not having a good time by the looks of it. All right. He's bringing up the early. How many disciples have we got? There's actually 13. Why has Rembrandt painted 13 disciples? There isn't 13 disciples. You see this guy here? Oh, hang on, I can do it here. Oh, I've got to do it here. All right, we'll get there. All right, zoom in. All right. This is actually Rembrandt. He painted himself on the boat. So I thought this is really, really interesting. Why has Rembrandt painted himself on the boat? Well, I think the answer is this. The reason why Mark records this text is not just for the disciples alone. It's not just to record what they experienced and what was happening at the time, but Jesus is actually helping us as the readers now to understand we are in the boat too. And Rembrandt saw that. So he puts himself in the boat. In verse 30, yes, that's right. Verse 39. Have I got that wrong on there? I have. It should be verse 40. Verse 40, it says, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" So while Jesus is asleep in the boat, while Jesus has command over everything, and the disciples are reacting amazingly to their problems, this storm, we picture Jesus asking these guys, why are you still so afraid? Why do you have no faith? I am here. I am with you. We don't have to go too far to find the storms in our life, as I said before. And sometimes we find ourselves in this same problem. We're in the boat with Jesus, but we find ourselves crying out for help. Not just crying out for help at this point, but we've been with him all the time. We've seen the amazing things that he can do. The disciples before this had just spent a number of months with him, traveling throughout the land, seeing amazing things. They'd seen all of these healings, a leper healed. They'd seen Peter's mother healed of disease. They'd seen his amazing teachings. And then they get into the boat and there's a problem and they're crying out. Now, in one sense, you could think that they're just crying out because they need help from Jesus. They want him to do something. Or they could be crying out going, there's nothing we can do. What are we going to do here? Now, these are our two responses that we've got. Often, though, I think we find ourselves in the latter category. We're crying out to Jesus saying, what are we going to do here? So this is where we got the disciples. So as we think about our own lives compared to these disciples, how have you felt you have travelled through a storm, a hard time? Has it been like these disciples, where things are really, really challenging, but you don't know what to do? You're not certainly trusting Jesus at the time. You're going through a problem, but you don't know who can solve it. You think you can do it, so you add extra weight into it. You do extra things. You say other things. You bring other people into it, try and solve the same problem. Certainly some of us around here can help one another. There's no doubt about that. But how do we go? Do we go to Jesus to ask for his help in that? Throughout the Bible, time and time again, this is what actually happens. In the Old Testament, we see the kings, spirit-led kings, who actually go to other armies to find their help rather than the Lord. Throughout the journey of the disciples, while they are very much with Jesus most of the time, and including this scene here, we find that they do the same thing. They go to other people for help. They wait until they have to ask for Jesus to intervene. I'm a person that likes control. I'm a teacher. That's my background. Teachers just love control. That's why they're teachers. All right. Okay. They're in control of the class. Well, at least they think they are. The students have other ideas. And in that, my process is that if I have not got control, that's when I start to freak out. Okay? Maybe some of these disciples were in the same sort of position. As I prepare for messages, there's an amazing sort of thing that happens. I've prepared hundreds of messages, but almost every time, without fail, I find myself in a point as I prepare where I find I'm in a storm. And it could be something unrelated to what I'm even preaching about, but sometimes it's actually quite closely related. You're in a position you cannot solve the problem. You're not sure what to do. Do I work even harder about this? Do I take more time? If I take more time on this, then I can't work on that over there, or whatever the work that we're doing. Can't work with the family, can't go out to see those people. Do I take more time? What do I do? So in this sort of position, you're like, here I am trying to work out how to preach about what it's like to live in a storm when I'm in a storm myself. I'm not sure where you're at right now. You might be in a similar position. So why am I still afraid in those times? Where is my faith at those moments? This is where Jesus wants to help us amazingly so today. So let's click on. Okay. So you're in a bit of a storm. Is the thought sometimes that Jesus doesn't care for what you're going through? I'm not sure if you've ever thought that through or thought about that, but evidently the disciples right now in this moment, in this storm, say this to Jesus himself and say, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Do you feel like that? Do you feel like God's gone to sleep on your greatest needs at that moment? Do you feel like, if God really loved me, if Jesus really loves me, he wouldn't let this happen? If Jesus really loved his disciples, why did he take them out into the lake? Why does he want them to drown? Is that what it's for? We investigate it further. We've read the story on. We know where it goes. And the truth is, this is actually the wrong premises to start from. Jesus does love us, yet he still wants us to go through storms. This is the truth. He still wants us to go through. Because you're doing Tim Keller series, everyone's going to quote Tim Keller. All right. Tim Keller says, in our need, Jesus will let us go through storms. We can't control the storms. 99.9% of the time, you can't control those storms. There's not much you can do about it. And we can't control Jesus. We can't control Jesus. Never think you can do that. Or his power either. We can't go and grab his power and use it for what we want. But while we're in the storms, and while the storms don't love us, Jesus does. So this is the truth. Jesus can, because he is greater. We've already established that. He is God, so he has power over the storm. But the amazing thing is that Jesus loves us in the midst of the storm. He wants to help us. He's going to help the disciples, and he wants to help us too. If we ever have the expectation that because we have faith in Jesus, we shouldn't have storms, we're probably in the wrong spot. We've got to adjust our faith or our expectations of what faith actually is for. But while our storms are great, Jesus is much greater. We have to reconcile that while difficult and tragic things will happen to us, if our faith is present in Christ, it's going to be okay. Let's look at some passages about this. So why is Jesus doing this? He's perfecting our faith. Let's have a look at this. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 to 2. It says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, Hebrews 11 had just given us an amazing an account of all these Old Testament saints who had gone through storms in life, yet sustained by their faith in God, who had a greater plan for them, they went through that. And so let us throw off everything that hinders us, so that easily entangles us, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. You know that in verse 2, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. So this second point about what Jesus can is all about the fact that when we're going through a storm, one of the great reasons that you are going through that storm is that your faith is going to be perfected through it. We don't perfect our faith on holidays. When we're on holidays, we put our feet up, we relax, we step back, we don't have a schedule to meet, there's no dramas happening, we don't solve any problems. We don't have to have any faith. It's while in the storm that our faith is going to be exercised. People regularly say that faith is like a muscle. It must be exercised to grow it. The storm is a good faith exercise, right? So that's why Jesus is out there in the middle of it with them. James says this. I'm going to do it on here as well. James says this in chapter 1, verse 2. Consider it pure joy. Certainly an interesting sort of thought. My brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials, is that a thought process that you go through? That takes great faith to have joy when you're in a trial. Your faith is not going, your eyes are not on the trial. Whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know it's the testing of your faith, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. And let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. So there's a real reason as you go through your trials that your testing of your faith may produce perseverance. Perseverance finishing its work so that you may be mature and complete. Growing through the trials is part of Jesus' plan. We were thinking about this morning in worship. We were thinking about the ideas of persevering when things are not going well. God has got a better plan for us as we go through it. This is I'm going to do this one. There we go. Picture of a couple of storms. This is 2015. The two storms were two Category 5 cyclones struck Australia at the same time. One just south of Darwin called Lamb, not with a B. And then Marcia was having a go at Queensland. Both Category 5 tropical cyclones. That means for some period during the time when they hit the land, the wind was travelling at over 250 kilometres an hour. All right? That's an amazing force. Some storms are not that bad in our lives, though. Certainly we can have some tragic storms, but every day there are storms in our lives. And these storms can be big. I want you to think, though, what is the greatest storm that you're facing? Well, this passage actually gives us a little bit of a picture into how great the storm is that really was facing the disciples. There's a distinct parallel between this storm, this story, and one that occurs in Jonah. The disciples asked at the end of this story, who is this? Which is a great question to ask. Who is this that even the winds and the waves obey him? The first thing is, when you look at, if you've ever read Jonah chapter 1, most of us have heard the story at least once in our Sunday schools, maybe 20 times. But the stories are, the parallels are very, very close. In Mark, chapter 4, verse 38, we just read that he was asleep. Jesus was asleep. In Jonah chapter 1, we read verse 5, it says that, but Jonah had gone below deck, where he laid down and fell asleep as well. So there's a parallel there. The next parallel, in verse 38, once again, the disciples woke him and said, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" In Jonah chapter 1, verse 6, the captain goes below and says to Jonah, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice so that we will not perish." They're perishing. The next one is in Mark 39, Jesus says, "Peace be still," and the winds ceased, and there was great calm. So we have a third point about peace, because in Jonah chapter 1, verse 15, it says, "And the raging waters grew calm." That was after they'd thrown Jonah into the water. So the 3 points that give us an amazing parallel between the two passages. I'm wondering whether Jesus knew that or God was planning it in his providence. Probably a bit of both. But there certainly is some distinct parallels. But there's actually one more point which is somewhat missing out of our Mark passage. In Jonah chapter 1 verse 15, there's an intervention. Oh, I just sort of said it before. In Jonah 1:15 it says, "Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard." Now they thought that would appease the God and stop the storm. Now certainly it did stop the storm. It wasn't to appease God. It was part of God's plan that Jonah would get thrown overboard and take him back to Nineveh, where he didn't want to go. But this intervention that we see is actually picked up by Jesus. Jesus actually sees this point as being the point of his coming into the world, in fact. In Matthew 12:40 it says, "For just as," Jesus says this, "For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." So when the disciples asked the question, "Who is this that the winds and the waves obey him?" there's something even greater going on. In the storm, the greatest storm that these disciples have and that we have today is not the fact that we've got storms in our lives which are disrupting what we would like to do or how we would like to do it, or making us have some fear, or we're scared or anxious. Certainly those things the Lord cares about. But the greatest storm that we all have is the fact that we have sin in our lives. And God's anger and God's wrath is on us. And we travel through life and most of us don't even know that. Yet Jesus has come and would live a perfect life in obedience, die on a cross, and then 3 days later be raised. And his resurrection will be proof of his life of perfection, but also be the picture of our own resurrection if we trust in him. And that we would get through a storm which we could not solve, not through any sort of work whatsoever. And so Jesus gives us a little picture here that any storm he is capable of having victory over. Not just the little ones, but the greatest one we have. Jesus is Jonah. Jesus is the Jonah who would protect us from our own sin. All right, what can we do then? What can we do then? I have a storm that happens in my life every Friday night. I'm running a youth group at the moment. It's the same youth group that the McLaughlins used to go to. I just happened to be 20 years later on. It's a great thing for me to do. I love doing youth groups. It's one of the ministries I feel like I'm called to. And I've been working with teenagers of some description for at least the last 23 years. But every afternoon, no matter how much planning I do, I know that there's going to be a storm. And around dinner time, I feel this. I can't do it. I can't do it. You see, in our group, we have a particular mix of youth at the moment. We have a group number one, bunch of private school people, kids, with their private school problems. I'm sorry if you're a private school person. That's all right, student. That's okay. But you have a whole lot of problems that they bring in, and that's fine. We work with those little storms that run in the doors. They literally have these little storms running around trying to affect other people's storms. And then I have another group of high schoolers from the local high school, public school system, and other high schools who come in as well. In fact, there's more of them than the others. And they have some difficult problems that they bring in that most of us have absolutely no idea of what to do with. The storms in their worlds are amazing. I think one of the reasons why they come to the group is for 2 hours on their Friday night, they actually don't have to cope with that storm. But we have these storms running around. And then I have myself with my little storm, like, what do I do? We plan like crazy, we design really great stuff, we do all this sort of stuff, but we know that when we turn up with our plans, we don't know if that will happen. It's amazing sort of thing to sort of think. So every Friday night, this is what's happening. So what can I do? Well, here's a couple of things to think about. First of all, I want to remember that Jesus is in the boat with us. The storm that we're going through in that boat, that Friday night, I have to remember that Jesus is in the boat with me. In fact, he's doing an amazing amount of things. Even if he's asleep in the boat, he's doing things for me that I can't even fathom. He has that ability. Jesus is developing my faith in that storm. So in that moment, when I'm sitting at dinner, I'm thinking through, what are we doing tonight? I have to think about, what is Jesus doing? What is Jesus going to do? How is Jesus going to help me? Can my faith be strengthened through this? Can he do things for me? I also need to remember that Jesus conquered my greatest need, that is salvation. And as I walk into the room with those other teenagers, I remember the purpose that he came for them. It's actually a very, very empowering thought to think that through him taking me through a storm, it will enable them to go through a storm. I can now enter into their storm. If I was so paralyzed by the storm that I was in, there's no way I could help them. There's an amazing sort of community thought there that you can think about how God strengthens as he strengthens your faith, you're able to help others. All right. What else can I do? Well, I can prepare by walking with Jesus when times are good. The disciples had been doing this. They'd seen all the miracles. They would do it again. They would see more miracles. In fact, they'd get into another boat later on and there'd be another storm that would come up later on in chapter 5. And they would go through another storm. So Jesus would do this time and time again. He'd show himself to them. They would walk with him. They would experience him. They would get to know him more. And then he'd take them back into a storm. He'd repeat the process, strengthening their faith. But when it is quiet, when it is calm, I need to get closer to Jesus so that I can be closer to him when I am in the boat in the storm. Have a prayer ready. So one thing I've started to do recently is just have a very quick, short prayer ready to go. I don't usually like to, it's not really a brethren thing to have written prayers or to have a prayer that you repeat. We like to be more relational. But sometimes when you're in a boat, when you are in a storm, you need something to go back to that's just all you can say. Sometimes it's, I can't do it. I can't do it. Can you do it for me? Something simple, because it will be repeated time and time again when you're in these storms. And Jesus understands that maybe that's all you can do. There might be something longer that you can have prepared or something more detailed, but I've gone to something as short as I can so that I remember to do it. Otherwise, the complexity of it maybe just put me off, and I may just not do it at all. But me coming before the Lord and saying, you need to do this, I can't do it, means that most probably I will do it because he will be doing it through me. I'm going to pray now, but I'm not sure what the storm in your life is going on at the moment. My prayer is, Lord, that the Lord would continue to carry you through it, and he will, but that you would look to him as he perfects you through this. Let's pray. Lord, I've said a bunch of words today, and I don't know, a lot of these people here I've never met. I don't know what problems they have. I don't know what storms that are going on in their lives. Maybe some really, really dark times that they're in now. There may be some really, really dark times or big storms coming up very soon. But we know that from reading this passage that you are the commander of any storm, that you can overrule any storm, but also if we're going through a storm, that you are great enough to carry us through that storm. My prayer, Lord, is that you would do what you need to do and what you do best in those times. Love to see the fact that you are an amazing God who cares for us individually and corporately, and that as you're using those storms, you're using them to display how great and good you are, but also to care for us, grow us, to become more like you. And we just give you thanks for the fact that you are the God of the storm. We pray this in your name. Amen.